In early 1934, an announcement of an air race to be held in October of the same year from England to Australia caused much interest and activity across the world. Colonel James Fitzmaurice, formerly Commandant of the Irish Air Corps and co-pilot of the first successful westbound crossing of the Atlantic Ocean by an aeroplane, gained sponsorship from the Irish sweepstake and contracted Giuseppe Bellanca to build him a suitable aircraft. The aircraft was designated the Bellanca 28-70, 28 for the 280 square feet of wing area and 70 for the 700 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp Junior power plant. With a steel tube fuselage fleshed out with wooden formers, stringers and covered in fabric, and a wooden wing, the Bellanca took 4 months to build. First flew on the 1st of September 1934. The undercarriage was retractable, and unusually for a low-wing monoplane, the Bellanca was wire braced, with the flying wires braced to a pair of king posts below the fuselage. The 2 fuel tanks, in total carrying some 600 US gallons, were mounted in the fuselage, with the cockpits behind, extending almost to the base of the fin. Direction and range-finding radio equipment was fitted, designed by Bill Lear, to be operated from the rear seat, and when the rear seat pilot was flying, the front seat could be lowered, giving an unimpeded view of the instrument panel. With a cruising speed of well over 200 miles an hour, the Bellanca was a very serious long-distance racer. Test flying complete, it was loaded as deck cargo aboard the SS Bremen and shipped to Southampton. That's when the trouble began. On arrival in Southampton, the weather was too poor to unload the Bellanca, and, unable to delay schedule, the Bremen steamed on to Bremerhaven with the aeroplane on board. With race day looming, this had caused the team to lose several precious days of preparation. Once unloaded, the Bellanca was flown straight back to Southampton Eastleigh, where it was fitted with its cowling, which had arrived on the next ship from New York, and then on to Mildenhall for the start of the race. However, no sooner had they arrived than a serious paperwork issue presented itself. The air race, organised by the Royal Aero Club under rules set out by the International Committee for Air Navigation, required that all aircraft were certified to land at maximum weight. The Bellanca, now christened Irish Swoop in honour of its sponsors, was not certified to this requirement. Instead, the larger of the 2 fuel tanks was fitted with a dump system, allowing it to empty 400 gallons in an astonishing 20 seconds. Appeals unsuccessful, Colonel Fitzmaurice and co-pilot Eric Bonner were given the option of operating the aeroplane at a much lower all-up weight, with more fuel stops, but there was no time left to plan. Reluctantly, and amongst much acrimony, the Irish Swoop was scratched from the race. On Saturday the 20th of October 1934 at 6:30 in the morning, the MacRobertson Air Race got underway, with 20 competitors heading for Melbourne, Australia. Later the same morning, the Irish Swoop left a now deserted Mildenhall, bound for Croydon. Little over 2 days later, Scott and Campbell Black had won the race. Back in Croydon, Colonel Fitzmaurice was already planning on breaking their new record. Eric Bonner, better known as Jock, flew the Irish Swoop to Portsmouth Aerodrome, considered the smoothest surface available, and carried out full-load landing tests under the supervision of the American Air Attaché. On the 30th of October, the Irish Swoop left Lymm, bound for Baghdad. They'd only been flying for an hour or so when bits started falling off, so Fitzmaurice and Bonner returned to Lymm. The Irish Swoop was shipped back to Bellanca at Wilmington, Delaware, damaged in a landing accident and left to sulk in the back of the hangar. In 1936, the damaged Bellanca was sold to Jim Mollison. Repaired and with the fuselage painted a garish orange, the Bellanca was uprated to -90 status with a 900 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp engine. Jim Mollison, a brilliant pilot, as brave as a lion, but a bit of a cad and a bounder in his private life, bought the Bellanca to make a series of record-breaking flights. His first record attempt in the Bellanca would be an eastbound flight from Newfoundland to London. On arriving in Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, Mollison was surprised to receive a good luck telegram from his wife. His wife, of course, was Amy Johnson, famous aviatrix, but they were getting divorced by this time. Mollison had even named the Bellanca after his latest squeeze, actress Dorothy Ward. Mollison's flight was successful, covering the 2,300 statute miles from Harbour Grace to Croydon in little over 13 hours. Mollison had planned on taking little over 11 hours, but had picked up severe icing on departure from Harbour Grace. He was forced to descend to sea level and circle for over an hour in warmer air until the ice finally fell away. Once in Croydon, the Bellanca was placed on the British Register and Mollison planned his next record-breaking flight. In May 1936, Amy Johnson had broken the record for a flight from London to Cape Town. Mollison decided to try and do better. Before he could do so, however, there was a spot of bother with paperwork. Mollison had bought the Bellanca from the Bellanca factory, but it didn't belong to Bellanca to sell. After some legal wrangling, it was established that no one had gone out to do anything particularly wrong, and the dispute was settled amicably. Mollison decided to take a co-pilot on the Cape flight, and he chose his friend Edouard Molinier, a debonair Frenchman and former First World War pilot. On the 29th of November 1936, the Bellanca lifted off from Croydon, bound for Marseille and then on to Alexandria. On reaching Alexandria in the dark, the runway lights had not been deployed as arranged. Mollison and Molinier were forced to divert to Cairo, where they weren't expected. After refuelling, the next leg should have taken them to Kisumu on the shores of Lake Victoria, but south of Khartoum, Mollison noticed a fuel leak in the cockpit. They turned north and landed in Khartoum for repairs. Frustratingly, RAF personnel in Khartoum could not find the source of the leak, so Mollison and Molinier refueled and headed south, leaving the cockpit's sliding hoods open to disperse the fumes. After further fuel stops at Kisumu and Broken Hill, they reached Kimberley, where Molinier had to be lifted from the cockpit of the Bellanca. By this time, both pilots were severely fatigued, but somewhat revived by the stop, they took on 4 hours worth of fuel, more than enough to cover the 500 miles to Cape Town. In a stroke of bitter irony, Cape Town Aerodrome was covered in low cloud. Try as he might, Mollison could not descend safely. Officials on the aerodrome could hear the Bellanca overhead, but, with fuel eventually running low, Mollison and Molinier were forced to land in a stubble field at Breedersdorp, southeast of Cape Town. When they arrived overhead Cape Town Aerodrome, Mollison and Molinier had broken Amy Johnson's record by over 2 hours. Unfortunately, under the rules of the time, this new record could not be recognised. The Bellanca was dismantled and eventually returned to England on a steamer. In spite of plans, Jim Mollison never flew it again, and like so many aeroplanes of the period, it was sold to Spain and destroyed during the Civil War. The Bellanca may not have ever achieved its full potential, but the same could not be said of the 4 principal airmen involved with it. Jim Mollison never made another record-breaking flight. On the outbreak of the Second World War, Mollison joined the Air Transport Auxiliary, delivering aircraft the length and breadth of Great Britain. He became one of their finest and most devoted pilots, much to the surprise of some who'd known him pre-war. Unfortunately, post-war, Mollison developed quite a thirst again. He died of an alcohol-related illness in 1959, aged 54. Swashbuckling Frenchman Edouard Molinier served in the Free French Air Force during World War II. He became one of the very few number of pilots who scored victories in both World Wars. After the war, he served in several French governments and died in 1963. By the outbreak of the Second World War, Colonel James Fitzmaurice had retired from flying. He ran a servicemen's club in London throughout the Second World War and then retired to his native Dublin. He died in 1965 and was awarded a state funeral, and like so many prominent Irishmen, is buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. Eric Bonner, known to his friends as Jock, was a non-commissioned pilot in the Royal Air Force during the 1920s. In 1932 he'd shown absolutely no regard for his own safety when rescuing a fellow pilot from the blazing wreck of a Siskin fighter. For his bravery, Jock Bonner was awarded the Empire Gallantry Medal, later exchanged for a George Cross. In the late 1930s, Bonner worked as a test pilot for the DK Aircraft Company, Rolls-Royce and Napier. After the war, he was a manager at Rollerson Aircraft in Croydon. He died in 1991 and his ashes were scattered on Croydon Aerodrome.